Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're tackling a profoundly human and, frankly, deeply complex topic. We're going to objectively map out the ethical, medical, legal, and theological landscape of terminal care decisions. Our goal here is to help you clearly grasp both sides of this really intense debate. Let's dive right in.
So, you might be wondering, why is this topic so incredibly relevant right now? Well, consider this. According to a 2017 Gallup poll, roughly 3/4 of Americans now favor legalizing physician-assisted suicide. I mean, that is a massive societal shift. It means that what used to be a somewhat fringe discussion has literally become a central question for modern medicine, law, and our own personal ethics.
Here's how we're going to break this down today. First, definitions and the legal landscape. Second, medical nuances and directives. Third, the case for euthanasia. Fourth, the case against it. Fifth, the biblical debate. And finally, number 6, the principle of double effect.
Let's start with Section 1, Definitions and the Legal Landscape.
It's absolutely crucial we get our terms straight here because they get mixed up all the time. First up, terminating life support. This is simply allowing a natural death to occur by withdrawing or withholding treatment, like, say, turning off a respirator. Second is physician-assisted suicide. This is where a doctor provides the instructions or the means, like a lethal prescription, but the patient actually takes the final action themselves. And lastly, euthanasia, which literally translates to easy death. This is when a physician takes direct active steps to end a patient's life, like administering a lethal injection.
The law has historically struggled to keep up with these definitions, as you can imagine. The legal landscape evolved through some pretty major turning points. Back in 1975 with the Karen Ann Quinlan case, the courts basically prioritized a patient's interests over the professional integrity of healthcare workers who wanted to keep her alive. Then the 1990 Cruzan ruling established that patients actually have the right to decline life-saving medical treatment. And yes, that includes food and water. Finally, in 1997, the Supreme Court ruled there's no constitutional right to die. But, and this is a big but, they left legalization up to individual states. Since then, at least 9 states, plus Washington, D.C., have moved ahead and legalized physician-assisted suicide.
Okay, moving on to Section 2, Medical Nuances and Directives.
To really understand modern definitions of death, we have to do a quick review of brain anatomy. The cerebrum is your higher brain. It's the control center for consciousness, cognition, and your memories. Then you have the cerebellum, which manages coordination and movement. And finally, the lower brain, or the brainstem. This governs your vegetative functions, stuff like breathing, heart rate, and sleep cycles.
Now, this anatomical distinction, it's vital. True brain death requires the entire brain to completely stop functioning, which gives you a flat EEG. But in a persistent vegetative state, or PVS, a patient loses all consciousness because that higher cerebrum stops working, but the brainstem keeps right on functioning. They keep breathing, their heart keeps beating. This creates some of the most agonizing terminal care dilemmas imaginable, mostly because recovery from PVS is highly unpredictable. There are documented cases where patients have lingered in PVS for nearly 20 years, only to miraculously wake up with their cognitive abilities totally intact.
So how do families avoid this kind of legal and moral nightmare if a loved one ends up in a state like PVS? They rely on advance directives. These range from best-case scenarios like a living will, where your exact wishes are legally written out, and a durable power of attorney, where you officially designate someone you trust to make those calls. Things get much, much messier when families have to rely on informal verbal directives or, honestly, the toughest scenario, a judgment of proxy, where no prior wishes are known at all, leaving a designated person to just guess what the patient would have wanted.
Let's look at Section 3, the case for euthanasia.
Ethicist James Rachels challenges the whole moral distinction between killing and letting die with a pretty fascinating thought experiment. Picture 2 guys, Smith and Jones, who both stand to inherit a massive fortune if their young nephew dies. Smith actively holds the child's head under the water and drowns him. Jones, on the other hand, watches the child slip and fall face down into the water and just stands there. He does absolutely nothing to help until the child drowns. Rachels argues that both acts are equally evil. His overarching point is that if the passive act is just as evil as the active act in this scenario, then an active act of mercy killing shouldn't be judged more harshly than passively letting a terminal patient suffer in excruciating agony.
Proponents also lean heavily into utilitarianism. The ultimate goal here is maximizing happiness and minimizing pain, especially for, say, a terminal cancer patient with only days left to live. They also invoke the golden rule. They ask us to stop and consider what we would personally want in a completely hopeless medical scenario. And the truth is, most people, when asked point blank, say they would prefer a quick and painless end.
Which brings us to Section 4, the case against euthanasia.
On the other side of the debate, ethicists like Ronald Munson, writing under the pseudonym J. Gay Williams, lay out three robust pillars of opposition. First is the argument from nature, or natural law. This states that euthanasia fundamentally does violence to our biological drive and our physical structure, which is literally designed for survival. Second is the argument from self-interest. Death is pretty permanent, right? Euthanasia permanently rules out the possibility of surviving a misdiagnosis or experiencing one of those sudden miraculous recoveries. And third, from practical effects. There is a very real worry that if euthanasia becomes routine, it could dull the medical community's overall commitment to fighting hard to save severely ill patients.
Building right off that practical effect is the classic causal slippery slope argument. The big fear here is that legally accepting personal suicide inevitably leads to deputizing doctors for physician-assisted suicide. From there, critics argue, it's a short slide into involuntary euthanasia for comatose patients who can't consent. And the ultimate, frankly terrifying fear is that we arrive at a societal expectation where the elderly or severely disabled actually feel they have a duty to die just so they don't emotionally or financially burden their families.
To put a human face on the argument for holding on to hope, our source material shares a really profound story. A father, suffering terribly from severe emphysema and pneumonia, initially wanted Dr. Jack Kevorkian's help to end his life. Doctors gave him virtually a 0% chance to live, but his family persistently fed him. They managed his pain effectively with morphine to keep his appetite up, and miraculously he rallied. He beat that 1% chance of survival. He ended up living 4 more deeply meaningful years and experienced immense spiritual growth. It's a powerful reminder that medical prognoses aren't always perfect.
Section 5, the biblical debate. For a lot of folks, this entire conversation is rooted in theology. And interestingly, both sides draw heavily on biblical texts to make their case. Proponents point out that the Bible heavily advocates for mercy and the relief of suffering. They note that the Apostle Paul actually views death as desirable, writing, "To die is gain." Plus, they argue the 6th commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," already has biblical exceptions like self-defense or just war, so mercy killing could just be another exception. Opponents, meanwhile, counter with the sanctity of life principle. They argue human life is God's property, period, so we don't have the right to destroy it. They emphasize that Scripture contains 0 explicit exceptions for taking innocent life for mercy. Finally, they point to texts in James and 1 Peter that highlight the profound character-building value of actually enduring suffering.
Opponents also make the case that, biblically speaking, death is an unnatural enemy. It wasn't part of the original design, and it's something to be fought. This perspective is beautifully captured in Dylan Thomas's famous poem, where he urges his dying father to resist death, rather than willingly succumbing to it under the modern guise of death with dignity. The argument here is that sometimes the most dignified thing you can do is go down fighting.
Finally, Section 6, the principle of double effect. So, how does all this philosophy play out in actual real-world hospital rooms? Well, consider the story of a 91-year-old woman in the final throes of kidney failure. She was in absolute agony. The doctor asked her family for permission to administer highly strong pain-relieving narcotics, but explicitly warned them that the medication would inadvertently hasten her death by about 8 to 12 hours. The family authorized the medication, and she passed away peacefully later that same day.
Now, the family justified this really difficult decision using a framework from the Roman Catholic tradition called the principle of double effect. This states that an action with mixed results, meaning both good and bad effects, is morally okay if 3 conditions are met. First, the evil cannot be the actual means of producing the good. In this case, the narcotic reduced the pain. The early death was just a side effect, not the mechanism of the pain relief itself. Second, the evil is not directly intended. The goal was solely pain reduction, not killing. And third, there has to be a proportionate reason. Here, the immense benefit of relieving that excruciating terminal pain heavily outweighed the harm of losing a few final hours of mostly unconscious life.
As we've seen throughout this explainer, the landscape of end-of-life ethics is just incredibly vast and deeply emotionally charged. We're constantly left trying to weigh this immense tension, showing absolute, compassionate mercy on one hand, while fiercely preserving the sanctity of human life on the other. It leaves us all with a profound final thought to chew on. In the face of terminal suffering, how do you balance the desire for a peaceful exit with the inherent duty to preserve life? Thank you so much for exploring this vital, challenging topic with me today.